When we launched Masters of the Universe Classic in 2007, 2008, I never thought we were going to make it deep in the line. I thought we were doing, six figures, one and done. The fact that we got past the first six, that we started expanding, that we had things like create a character contests and fan choice figures, and the line exceeded beyond my wildest imagination. I thought Justice League Unlimited was going to be the backbone of Matty Collector. The fact that it wound up being Masters of the Universe Classic was absolutely a shock and a surprise, but a good one. And getting to do things like vehicles and multi-packs and giant dragons and weapons pack, it was a dream come true. But it also meant a bit of a logistic, I don't want to say nightmare, but a logistical hurdle, because here we were now in 2013. We were pretty deep into the line, and the goal was to keep it going as long as possible. Well, doing that while keeping it fresh and holding back certain major characters for each year proved to be a difficult thing. And we kind of dug ourselves into a hole because, well, we got to the point that we were releasing figures that might have been a little too obscure for fans, and there was a lot of pushback. On top of that, we also had to deal with rising costs, which we'd sort of been ignoring for 4 years. When the line started, we, and by we, I mean I, created a giant spreadsheet going all the way to 2017, laying out who would get released each month. And again, this was done in advance to make sure that each year had a robust character selection, and that we didn't run out of characters too quickly. But now here we were about halfway through the line, halfway through, Mattel's major run of it at least, in 2013. And while we started off with a lot of jelly beans, we were definitely looking at fewer and fewer really gold nugget jelly beans. Do jelly beans come in gold nugget flavor? I mean, maybe the yellow ones. I don't know. But the bigger issue was the price change. So we had been holding on to $20 as the SRP since 2009. That was, like 4 years. That was not easy to do. We were able to do that because we were selling the line online through Matty Collector, not at retail, but margins were being eroded away. And there was a lot of suggestions that, well, maybe we should just raise prices by $1 every year. And that is something that was looked into. But in the end, we kind of held off and did what we could to maintain the prices as long as possible. But by 2013, that just wasn't going to work anymore. So the first figure with the new pricing of $25 was Netossa, a Princess of Power figure from the Vintage series, Vintage cartoon, and one of the harder figures to find in the Vintage line, which is actually why we did her. So let's go in and talk about that and how price changes affected the line and how Netossa came about. Well, actually, she came about pretty much like any other figure on your standard Masters of the Universe Classic blister. The blues and silver of her outfit definitely popped. She had a really cool color scheme that very few figures have, that kind of blue scheme. I guess Frosta has a little bit of that too. But she also represented the fact that, well, she was an African-American female. And I'm not at all someone for putting lines in, or rather putting figures into a line simply because of ethnicity. But when we did have her in the slot, the Horseman mentioned, we've never done a African-American female before. I was like, wait a minute. Could that seriously be possible? I mean, the reason that we chose Netossa was not because she was African-American. It was because, as I said, she was really hard to find in the Vintage line, and because of her outfit with the thin material of the cape and the netting, much like Spinnerella, they tended to break, or at least, shred, if you will. So finding a mint Spinnerella and a mint Netossa these days is kind of hard to do, and that's why we wanted to get her in Classics, to give fans a Netossa figure that they could have that, wasn't going to be, fall apart like the Vintage figure or be really hard to find. So that was the motivation behind putting her. It was completely based on how difficult she was to find in the Vintage line. But when we brought this up to the Horsemen in sort of our annual meeting, going over all the figures, and we like to do figures again like Optic, like Hero, the cosmic version of that Hero, because it was a cool way of getting to figures that you couldn't have as a kid or might have been really hard to find. Optic, for some reason, was one of those figures that everyone wanted. So we obviously also wanted to build out the Princess of Power faction. So Netossa made sense for a lot of reasons. She was hard to find. She had a very, very vivid color scheme with the blues and the silvers. But when I brought up to the Horsemen, or rather when they brought up to me, said, we've never done in our entire time at Mattel an African-American female action figure. And I'm thinking, like, can that possibly be true? And I started going through all of the different African-American females, or rather all the African-American action figures we'd done, things like in DCU Classics, like, okay, well, Mr. Terrific, oh, no, Black Lightning, no, definitely not a female. And yeah, they were right. We'd done a lot of African-American heroes, but we'd never done a heroine. And it was well past time. It was definitely an oversight. Vixen was supposed to be in the 75th anniversary line. She's on the package art, but unfortunately she never made it out. She's one of the only figures that was in the art that didn't make it a figure in the DC 75th line. She did make it out into the line eventually after I left Mattel as more of a modern version of Vixen. But yeah, the Horsemen were right. They had never done an African-American female figure before at Mattel. Craziness. So Spinnerella became the vehicle for that. She became their very first time. I mean, they'd done female figures, obviously, and we'd experimented a lot of different ways of doing females, from soft goods to more articulation, less articulation, netting, all sorts of different ways of plussing up figures to make them pop. But yeah, doing the facial features of an African-American female. We'd done Vixen in the JLU line, which I was very familiar with. But yeah, I guess it just crossed streams in my mind that I realized we'd never done that in 6-inch with the Horsemen, because the Horsemen didn't sculpt JLU. So Netossa became the very first, and a worthy figure it was, because she came out beautiful. I mean, they really, really nailed it. And it was great that not only could you get this figure that was relatively hard to find back in the vintage line, but she could now be sturdier, because we made her net, her cloth, or her cape, out of PVC rubber instead of making it out of actual fabric. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to her sword because of the cost, but we did get the sword out in a weapon pack, which at least was saving grace, because we never like to leave figures with any weapons sort of left on the cutting room floor. And then one last little tidbit on Netossa is her, I guess, headdress, for lack of a better word. So the vintage toy had a much different headdress than she had in the animated series. And a lot of fans of the Classics toy asked why we couldn't do the headdress, or at least do head swaps, so we could have more than one head, so you could do both her vintage toy headdress and her animated series look. And really the answer is it came down to the expense of doing her netted cape. The cape was very expensive to do because of, it had to be of a high quality plastic so it didn't tear. We had some of those issues with leach. So we basically had to make a choice. We could either do the cape or we could do the headdress. And it was felt that the cape, the net, being part of her name, was a much more important part of Netossa than the headdress. So while we were able to do the sword in a weapon pack, unfortunately we never got to her other vintage toy headdress. But it was also there to have consistency and have all of the figures look like action figures and less like dolls, so that if the figures came out in the vintage line, this is how they would have looked, as opposed to coming out in the girl line. So that was a bit of the thought process behind that. Did it work for everyone? No, none of the decisions we made in Classics ever worked for everyone, but at least you now know some of the method behind the madness, and, well, next week we've got quite a figure to get to. I'll just leave you with a little tease for that for now.